William Shakespeare was undoubtedly one of the most famous playwrights and poets of all time. His most famous work now is his 154 sonnets that he wrote. Even though when the sonnets were written, they were not famous at that time. William Shakespeare, he was born with the name Julius Phyllis Johannesburg Shakespeare on April 23rd, 1564. And ironically, he died 52 years later to the date on April 23rd, 1616. So he died on his birthday. His parents were John and Mary Shakespeare. Mary came from a wealthy family. Her dad owned a lot of farmland, and when her dad passed away, a lot of that was her inheritance. And John had no problem taking or dipping into her inheritance whenever they were in financial troubles. And there's no evidence to say if William Shakespeare's parents could even write. Scholars have seen their signatures on documents, but there's no evidence to show whether they were able to write past that. William Shakespeare started attending school in Stafford around the age of 5, and that's where he learned to read. And in Stafford, that was where the prosperous and successful people sent their kids to school. So he went to school among the prosperous and successful people's kids. It's thought that William Shakespeare attended school until the age of 15. However, no one really knows. During that time, the age of 15 is usually when kids or teenagers would stop going to school. So people assume that that's when he stopped going to school. After school, no one really knows what he did in between schooling and playwright. Besides, it's known that he, or assumed that he was a school teacher in the country. Before he went off to do playwrights, he actually got married at the age of 18 and a half to Anne Hathaway. He was considered a minor at that time, and so he had to have his father's permission to marry Anne. And when they got married, Anne was 8 years older than him, and she was 3 months pregnant. So their wedding was a shotgun affair. Their wedding only consisted of one band, where traditionally, back in that time, to officially be married, people had 3 bands, wedding bands. Shortly after their marriage, about 6 months after they got married, they had their first child, Susanna Shakespeare. And then 2 years later, they had twins, Hamnet and Judith Shakespeare. So Hamnet was Shakespeare's only known son, but there are rumors that William Shakespeare had another son with a lady named Miss Davenant. And Miss Davenant's son's name was Sir William Davenant, but it's not 100% sure, it's a rumor. But Hamnet, Shakespeare's only known for sure son, he died at a really young age. Judith, the other twin, she lived unusually long life for that time. After his children were born, he moved off to London and took some minor acting jobs. His first play that became successful was Henry VI. His first poem that was printed was Venus and Adonis, and that was one of his most popular poems, probably because of his openly erotic content in it. In the second half of the 1590s, that's when he started to really gain success. During that time, he wrote Titus, Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, and Julius Caesar. And after that, he wrote some more tragedies that became very successful as well. In 1609 were when William Shakespeare's sonnets were actually published. Today his sonnets are like his most popular work, but back then nobody showed any interest in his sonnets. So his sonnets were ignored for more than 200 years after being published. They were mostly read by scholars looking into Shakespeare's biography more than poetic entertainment. Centuries later, they're much more appreciated and read for the poetic entertainment. Sonnets were the first evidence of sonnets were in the 14th century during the Renaissance, and Thomas Wyatt was known to bring sonnets to England in the 16th century. And those sonnets, the 14th century sonnet, they're known as the Italian sonnets, and then the one that Thomas Wyatt brought them about in the 16th century, they're the Elizabethan sonnets. Italian sonnets are 14, and Elizabethan sonnets are 14 lines, so they're alike in that nature, but Italian sonnets shift at the 9th line, and Elizabethan sonnets usually shift between the 12th and 13th line. So William Shakespeare's sonnets contain 154 numbered sonnets, and in the published documentation with the sonnets was also a poem called A Lover's Complaint, which is voiced by a woman who had a miserable love affair with a dishonest man. So it seems like William Shakespeare did not have much involvement in the publication of the sonnets or the publication of A Lover's Complaint, since the sonnets don't mirror the characteristic spellings and are thought to have not been printed from a copy that Shakespeare made. The title page to the sonnets, it says this: "To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet, wishes the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth, T.T." So T.T. is Thomas Thorpe, who theoretically wrote that dedication, and he's the publisher of the sonnets. But who Mr. W.H. is a mystery. It's an unknown person. Scholars have been trying forever to figure out who is Mr. W.H. It could be William Herbert, Henry Worthieth Hesley, William Hayton, Willie Hughes, William Hall, William Hathaway. Some even think it was Queen Elizabeth. And then some think W.H. stands for William himself, so actually dedicated to Shakespeare. And also there's nothing to prove that the sonnets are reflecting Shakespeare's own private preferences, or if they're just in order of the editor. There's been multiple attempts to rearrange the order of them, but none of the attempts have stuck. The sonnets were written presumably over about 15 years, from the early 1590s to 1605. So it took about 15 years to write the sonnets. A scholar named Edmund Malone, he was the first to divide the sonnets into two sections. Sonnets 1 through 126 are addressed to a young man known as the fair youth. And then sonnets 127 through 154 are addressed to a woman known as the dark lady. And none of these sonnets in the whole entire sonnets mention the fair youth or the dark lady, but most scholars accepted Edmund Malone's findings to be fact, which has made a huge impact on their interpretation of the sonnets themselves. Critics have recently begun to renounce this finding, though. William Shakespeare's sonnets are 14 lines. This format, though, isn't true for all of his sonnets, because number 99 and 126 have a different number of lines. Some believe that the sonnets are autobiographical and confessional and tell a story. Others believe they are just poems that William Shakespeare wrote and put in order that he sanctioned. Several critics and biographers of William Shakespeare assume that these sonnets are written to real people, like the fair youth and the dark lady. Assume that the fair youth may actually be who Mr. W.H. stands for. But all the assumptions have been discredited and replaced with new assumptions, and the old assumptions often return. For over 400 years after the publication, there's no actual answer, and there probably never will be, because there's no evidence, and odds are that the sonnets are actually fictional. And the identity of the fair youth mostly matters to the people that actually believe that these sonnets are autobiographical. So no one really even knows if the sonnets 1 through 126 were addressed to the same man or even a man at all. The gender is not addressed in some of the sonnets, and some of them could have been addressed to a man or a woman. And most of the sonnets in 127 and on are addressed to a woman, but they might not have all been to the same woman. Depending on the reader could read it differently. Some of the sonnets could be addressed to man or woman. According to scholars, more than 100 sonnets were not even addressed to any gender. And from the research that I did, one of the articles that I read said that it was like 70% of the sonnets could either be interpreted as being addressed to a man or a woman. So when you take away the division that Edmund Malone put on the sonnets, it really lets you widely interpret the sonnets however you want. People can actually apply them to their own life and interpret them as male or female, which is one of the most intriguing features of the sonnets. From the research and from what I've read, that these sonnets could have been like a sketchbook or literary exercises for William Shakespeare for his plays, because the sonnets do align with some of his plays. So the sonnet that I decided to interpret whenever I was reading the sonnets was sonnet number 14. And sonnet number 14 says, "Not from the stars do I my judgment pluck, and yet methinks I have astronomy, but not to tell of good or evil luck, of plagues, of dearths, or seasons' quality, nor can I fortune to belief minutes tell, pointing to each his thunder, rain, and wind, or say the princess if it shall go well. By oft predict that I in heaven find, but from thine eyes my knowledge I derive, and constant stars in them I read such art, as truth and beauty shall together thrive. If from thyself to store thou wits convert, or else of thee this I prognosticate, thy end is truth and beauty doom and date." So my interpretation of this sonnet, line by line. Line 1 basically means that the poet doesn't get her knowledge or make her decisions from the stars. And line 2 means that I have enough training in astronomy to get my knowledge from the stars. Line 3, I cannot foresee good or bad luck. And line 4 means which I also cannot predict plagues, starvation, or the weather. Line 5 means I also can't say what will happen at any given moment in our daily lives. And line 6 means the poet cannot predict personal troubles. Line 7 means the poet cannot predict the fate of kingdoms. Line 8 means the poet cannot predict any of this by looking at the stars or up to heaven. Line 9. Now line 9 is where the volta happens, which is the turn in the poem, which is unusual for Shakespeare because a lot of Shakespeare's poems are Elizabethan poems, but since the turn is line 9 starts with the word but, it's the turn in the poem of Shakespeare's argument, and so it's actually an Italian styled sonnet. But the interpretation of line 9 means I get all of my knowledge from your eyes alone. In line 10, your eyes are the stars that I get my knowledge from and can see the future through. Line 11, I see truth and beauty living together in unity. Line 12, only if the fair youth or whoever this poem was written to, or even if it was intended for anyone, because we really don't know who it was written to, has a child, and assuring his beauty will carry on for future generations. Line 13 and 14 mean if he does not have a child, the death of truth and beauty will happen when he lets his family genetics die. So if he doesn't reproduce, then his beauty will not carry on in future generations. What I found interesting actually while reading these poems, because before this class and I've never read a sonnet before, ever. So I was reading through the sonnets and I noticed that some of them were actually written to a male, and Shakespeare's a male. So I noticed that and I started to wonder, well, is Shakespeare actually homosexual? But from reading and researching on these sonnets, I've realized that these sonnets are probably most likely fictional, number one, and they're not really addressed to, in my opinion, not addressed to a certain person. And also that the first little bit of his sonnets are about procreation, and you can't procreate without a man and a woman. So that's another thing that I feel like makes it that Shakespeare wasn't writing this from himself to a man. And so that's kind of what makes it fictional for me. And maybe these sonnets were actually just part of his sketchbook, and or part of, you know, him trying to write lines for his plays. But the only person that actually knows exactly who these sonnets were written to is William Shakespeare himself, or if they're even written to anybody. And he's also the only one that probably knows who Mr. W.H. is. William Shakespeare passed away over 400 years ago, so I guess the mystery will just last forever.